as I'm saying here now in the next outline, or will now in a moment, the now leaderless, the Eastern Christians, Eastern Arabs, dispersed into the desert, but they became then powerful. So that's the dynamic, so to speak, of Eastern versus Western Arabs right around 602. And that's an important point of departure into which we will go then in a moment. As it so happened, however, just a few months after the Persian Shah had decided to murder his vice-regent in the desert, a usurper in Constantinople overthrew the Roman emperor. And Phocas, the usurper emperor, then was a usurper against whom the Shah Khosrow II of the Persians went to war because he wanted to avenge the overthrow of the previous emperor, for the reason that Khosrow had been helped already a few years earlier by the Roman emperor to regain his throne. There was a brief revolt in Persia. The Romans and the Persians always had hostility against each other, but there were also periods of peace, and so they intermarried and so on. And so it was not surprising that Khosrow declared himself now the avenger of the murdered Roman emperor and went to war against the usurper. Of course, now he lacked a representative in the desert because just a few months earlier, the Eastern Arabs had, after the murder of their king, had dispersed into the desert, and so there was not much that he could do now as far as the desert zone in terms of the war of the Persians against the Romans was concerned. Now the war, well known, no need now to go into the details, moved back and forth. At one point, the Persians conquered almost all of the Roman Empire. They went as far as Egypt. But then the war turned around miraculously under a new emperor, Heraclius, who then turned turned the tables and turned the entire situation around, and eventually in 628 actually even advanced against the capital of the Persians. So that was the end then of Khosrow, and the end also of the Persian Empire, because there was no clear successor. In that particular situation now, because the Arabs were among themselves in a way throughout this war period, 602 to 628, because on neither side were they needed or wanted. They were among themselves. So that's the important consideration that we have to think of now, with the idea that the Eastern Arabs were a bit stronger than the Western Arabs, but both were now in the Syrian desert and watched from afar how the biggies were killing each other, so to speak, the two empires. And then in 622, right when the war was beginning to turn in favor of the Eastern Romans, they declared an Arab kingdom, 622. This is very important that this Arab kingdom was declared at that particular time, because actually from the Islamic tradition, so that the sources that are dated 200 years after the emergence of the early Muslims, 622 is which date? The date of the Hijrah, the emigration of Muhammad from Mecca to Medina, and in Medina then the organization of the early Islamic community according to the Islamic tradition. Well, now in the Christian sources of the period, 622 is the date of the declaration of the Arab kingdom. And accordingly then, those Christian chroniclers of the period always then talked about what then happened with this Arab kingdom. So let's get then to this dark moment, so to speak, in the Syrian desert. We know that Eastern Arabs dispersed, made themselves dominant, so probably the Western Arabs were subservient, or at least they were being battled against, or maybe there were conflicts, or maybe there was also gradually a merging of the two. We don't know. So that would be pure speculation, and as a good historian, I'm not doing that particular thing. I'm merely, for purposes of illustration, I want to show you, yes, there is a connection here between the Islamic sources of 200 years later and what the Christian chroniclers of the 600s say, only it's being described a little differently. Instead of a hijrah of a prophet by the name of Muhammad migrating from Mecca to Medina, we are talking about an Arab kingdom emerging. And right from the start, this Arab kingdom, according to one Christian chronicler, consisted of two leaders and two sides. And this is perhaps the most important source here for the understanding of the beginning of Islam, because we are talking about probably Western Christianized Arabs forming one side, Eastern Christian Arabs forming another side, and each had a leader. That corresponds to when Muhammad was in Medina with his efforts of Muhammad's to return to Mecca and to convert Mecca from polytheism to monotheism. And of course, the Meccans resisted, and eventually their resistance was worn down. Two sides and two leaders, because, of course, when Muhammad was in Medina, there was a leader of the so-called pagan Arabs in Mecca, Abu Sufyan, who represented the other side. So, if this is indeed true, then the Quran is actually very helpful. I mentioned a little earlier, we now know that the Quran is truly, dates truly to the 600s. In which way it came about, that is still very mysterious. From what I am saying here, we have to assume that it came together as a scripture between 602 and sometimes toward the end of the 600s. And when I say 602, that's of course the time when the Eastern Christian Arabs dispersed in the Syrian desert. Note, by the way, that I'm not saying anything about Mecca and Medina. I'm merely talking about the Eastern and Western Arab Christians in the Syrian desert, wherever they were. Now, that gets us then to the Quran, which is a reliable source now for our further investigation. And that is, there is a curious term, mushrikun, that appears about 19 times in the Quran, and is usually translated as pagans and polytheists. But in 1999, Jared Hotting published a very important book. Hotting is also among those who contextualize and seek to understand the beginnings of Islam in a wider context. And he determined that these mushrikun were actually Christians. But that's where the book ends. And we have to go much farther than those Christians. And so therefore, I wanted to include here now a few verses that give us an idea here how much further we can go. Indeed, those who have believed and those who were Jews and Sabians and the Christians, Nasara and the Magians, and those who associate the or Ashraku, so these are the mushrikun. Allah will judge between them on the day of resurrection. Indeed, Allah is over all things. And that's this particular Quranic verse. Now, there was an historian metropolitan who lived a bit later, and who can be related to that particular Quranic verse, because in his writing, which is accessible through his composition Majalis, he says the following: as for the monotheists, to whose monotheism the Quran testifies, whom we recognize to be confessing that God is one, that God is one, they are as we ourselves, that is the Nestorians, the Jacobites, and the Melkites. The Melkites are the Chalcedonians, and that is a particular term that was being used at that time for the imperial Christians, meaning those under the king. And those of the Christians who follow our way. As for the polytheists, the mushrikun among them, they are the people who imitate Christianity, like the Marcionites, the Dysonites, the Manichaeans, and the Tritheists. And there you also have the Arabic term. those who posit three, and others who trace their origins to Christianity, but who are devoid of Christianity and far removed from it. So in other words, the Tritheists are Christians.